Hello and welcome to Teaching and Learning at Harvard, looking back, looking forward. This is the first session of Teaching in Unprecedented Times, a fall 2020 showcase. This week of activities is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advanced Learning in partnership with teaching and learning centers across the university. I'd like to invite Vice Provost Bharat Anand to kick things off for us today. Bharat, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Welcome everyone to this showcase event. I'm Bharat Anand, Vice Provost for Advances in Learning and a professor at Harvard Business School. And we're really excited about hosting this event, or rather series of sessions over the next couple of days. And I just wanted to start by thanking the entire VPAL team and all the teaching and learning centers who have put in efforts towards this event. The event is really aimed to sort of reflect, I think, to begin with, on what was an unprecedented spring and fall last year, to also, frankly, honor the efforts of faculty, students, and staff during the last 9 months, and to the extent we can, also surface interesting ideas and innovations that might inform not only the spring semester, but also the longer term. And with that, let me just turn it over to Provost Alan Garber to kick off Showcase 2020.
Thank you, Bharat. I want to add my welcome, and I want to just thank Bharat, Dustin, the other people in the Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning, the people involved in the teaching and learning centers throughout the university, Hewitt, and the faculty and staff, many of the people who are here now who have done so much to enable us to succeed through a challenge that none of us expected, that really began largely in March of last year. This could have been a disaster, but instead, you collectively have turned this into a tremendous opportunity for the university. And here I have to say that some of you have taken engineering courses, and you know that a common way to teach in engineering is to give the students a limited number of objects and ask them to go build something that just seems impossible. Like build a robot using toothpicks, marshmallows, and rubber bands that can carry a tennis ball from one end of the room to the other. It's a tough task, but it's the sort of thing that helps develop resourcefulness and novel thinking. And I think that's very much what happened here when we were posed with an unimaginable constraint that we would need to educate our students when almost nobody could be on campus. I read just in the past week, I think it was in The Economist, a quote from a CEO of a tech firm who said that the pandemic made it possible for them to create change in 6 months that under ordinary circumstances would have taken 10 years. And I think that's a bit of what we're seeing here. This conference is about looking back and looking forward. But of course, all of us are asking the question, how do we build upon what we've learned from this experience? How can we make education at Harvard and elsewhere better based on what we learned? Of course, people who have been teaching at Harvard have become more facile in the use of Zoom and some other technologies, but we know it's not really about the technologies, it's about rethinking how we teach and how we learn. We were particularly fortunate, I believe, because of the vast experience we had already accumulated across the university in online education. And the kinds of resources that we had put in place were really remarkable, and other institutions have tried to learn from the way that we had set up our capabilities in this area. There is no question in my mind that had we not made those earlier investments, we would not have been nearly as successful. I'm very bullish about the future. I think that our community is deeply dedicated to teaching and learning. I think that we have been forced to approach teaching and learning in new ways. And furthermore, faculty who might have been perfectly comfortable teaching in the classroom in the ways that we've done for decades, if not centuries, have not only been forced to change how they teach, but have actually embraced it with considerable enthusiasm. For all of these reasons, I think that the future of education at Harvard is going to be brighter than it would have been without the pandemic. And I'd like to thank all of you for your contributions to that. And I wish you all a very productive and engaging conference. And I look forward to hearing the talks and hearing what you take away from it. Thank you very much. Bharat?
Thanks so much, Alan. Really appreciate those remarks. What I'd like to do is jump right into the first session for Showcase 2020 at this point. It's entitled Looking Back and Looking Forward. And what I'd like to do is spend roughly half the time on each part. For this discussion, we've assembled a terrific cross-section of faculty colleagues and leaders from across Harvard. I'll briefly introduce them in alphabetical order. And as I do so, I just would love for you to recognize that beyond being administrative leaders, their scholarship also turns out is remarkably relevant to this period. Amanda Claiborne, Dean of Undergraduate Education, who oversaw, with Claudine Gay's leadership, the entire effort around Harvard College for remote teaching last spring and fall. Amanda is a professor of English, and her scholarship, it turns out, addresses the role of teachers and writers during periods of social change. And in the past, Amanda, you've often talked about the importance in your own teaching of meeting students where they are. So we look forward to hearing from you. Dan Levy, professor at the Kennedy School. And I should say that during the early days of the pandemic, I was seeing a lot of Dan Levy, although it wasn't this Dan Levy. It was the series Schitt's Creek on Netflix. However, I'm delighted to have Dan join us, who's an online learning leader at the Kennedy School, helped create Teachly, which is a web application to help teachers engage, and author of Teaching Effectively Through Zoom, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. Dan, welcome. Shrikant Datar, a colleague of mine at Harvard Business School, master design thinker beyond being an accountant, behind the transition to remote teaching in March, and then responsible for taking the lead in building the hybrid classroom during the summer. And finally, as of 12 days ago, the new dean of Harvard Business School. Welcome, Shrikant. Finally, last but not least, Bridget Terry Long, dean of the Education School, who's only been writing about higher education and K through 12 for many, many years, and who led the transition at the Ed School for the last 9 months. Her own work has looked at student transitions from high school to college, the role of instructor quality, class size, support structures in educational attainment, all particularly relevant during 2020. Welcome, Bridget. I want to start with a question to each of you. What are the key learnings from your perspective from the last 9 months? And Dan, I'd like to kick off with you. This is the book you wrote during the pandemic, I should say. And by the way, this is an example of a hack. There is no hardcover copy of this book. So if you open it up, it's actually a different book. I had to download my Kindle cover and paste it on this book. But you recently told me that you decided to write the book at the end of May, which is somewhat remarkable. And it was published in early July. 2 questions for you. What was the main message of the book? And secondly, what were your learnings during this experience, having already been an expert in online teaching, hearing from others?
Thank you very much, Bharat. I'm going to answer your questions, and I'll do it in the context of the 3 minutes that you have instructed us to obey by. And before I do that, I want to acknowledge a few people who have shaped my views of today, who gently contributed to it. And here they are. So I want to start by thanking them. So I think in terms of the lessons learned for me, I would summarize them in 3 words. The first word is appreciation. I think it's fair to say that most of us have appreciated more than ever teaching in person. And I think this year we missed that, and we realized how much of a profoundly human experience this was. So I think this particular year made us appreciate what we do with our students in the same physical space. But I also, as Alan mentioned, I also think there was appreciation for the opportunities opened by online teaching. And this leads me to the second word that I think summarizes my thoughts on the lessons learned, which is reconceptualization. I think from my perspective, most of us having to teach online was such a disruptive experience that we had to question some of the assumptions we make when we teach, and it has made us reimagine our teaching. And so one of the things that has been most interesting for me is to see the amount of creativity and resourcefulness of instructors. When I was writing the book, I went and observed many colleagues teach online. And this was one of the things that I most sort of saw. So this is a second sort of keyword that I would like to sort of point out. The third keyword is, and sorry that the slides are not showing, but the third keyword is exhaustion. I think teaching online was much more tiring than teaching in person for most of us. It was simply exhausting. And I think it has also been exhausting for our students. I think we have worked very, very hard to optimize the teaching of our individual courses, but I don't think we have created yet an optimal overall online learning experience for our students. And I don't think this is just about extracurricular stuff. I think this is about realizing that Zoom fatigue and screen fatigue are real, and that all of us assigning videos for our students to watch before class and then teach those same students via video means that our students are spending an inordinate amount of time in front of their screen. I think taking one course online is not the same as taking all your courses online in the midst of a pandemic. And I don't think we recognize that fully at an institutional level. So those are kind of my three words: appreciation, reconceptualization, and exhaustion are the three things that I gather from last year.
Thank you, Dan. That's really helpful. And it's also useful to keep in mind, I think, as you were speaking, that many ways the experience that Harvard had with online teaching for the last 9 or 10 years, a lot of it had to do with asynchronous teaching, actually. Right?
Yes.
Quite different, yes. I think, from the Zoom fatigue that you're talking about.
That's right.
And, just to put those numbers in perspective, it took us about 9 years to maybe get 300 to 500 faculty experienced with online teaching. And then we had about 9 days to get another 3,000. And that's the scale, I think, of the challenge that you're referring to. But thank you. I'd love to come back to you and talk about examples that you've seen that are particularly interesting and motivating. If I turn to Bridget. Bridget, you were in the thick of things, obviously, in March as a dean, and not just a dean, but a dean of the education school. And you also made some key decisions pretty early, right? Earlier, in fact, than most of the university in committing to remote teaching for the entire year. Can I request you to just share with us your thinking during that period, the key decisions, and what you've learned during the last 9 months?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Bharat. And Dan, I think I'm going to build a bit on your comments. Before getting started, though, I really have to recognize and thank my faculty and staff and our colleagues around the university. This has been tremendous work, and it has been exhausting, and we're still in the midst of it. And people really took a leap of faith, and they gave time they ordinarily would not have to really make sure that this pivot was successful. So to give you a little bit of the context of the ed school, even before COVID, we have been in a multi-year process of reevaluating our master's degree, redesigning around what are the core competencies and learning experiences we want our students to have. And this builds upon our PhD program and EDLD program, other academic innovations. And that certainly helped a great deal as we had goals put before us and knew what kind of learning experiences we wanted to have for our students. But something that became clear very early on, and if I recall last spring, I think it was the announcement when the university could not hold commencement in person, that I personally got to this point of feeling like we were compromising too much, that there were so many things we were not able to do, that we had to take a step back just because of the pandemic. And I really started to shift and really the ed school altogether and focusing on this as an opportunity. Because of past investments, because of a clear kind of vision of what we wanted to head towards, we really took this as an opportunity, and it was very much in very rapid time, used it to invest in ourselves, to invest in creating a really high quality remote experience. And so we did lean into deciding that we were going to have this full academic year remote, which I have had many of my faculty and actually students thank me for that early decision, but that allowed us to invest. It allowed us to really engage in curriculum design for online learning, rethinking all of our courses, to really invest in our teaching capacities. But beyond just the courses, we also really had to rethink the student support model. We created something called a student success team, which drew staff and faculty from across the school to think about how are we going to support students with remote learning, particularly in the midst of a pandemic, racial injustice, pending economic recession, and so forth. And then also a number of administrative shifts. So we started to see this more as an opportunity in how could we build something new rather than feeling like we were compromising. An important part of this was when we decided to be remote for the year, we opened up admissions. We had a short summer admissions round last year. This was partly predicated on the fact we were worried about melt of students who had been accepted in the spring. But when we opened up summer admissions, we stumbled upon this dramatic response in terms of highly, highly talented people who otherwise would not have been able to move to Cambridge, but now that we were remote for a year, saw this as a great opportunity to be part of the Harvard community. And so that's one of the wonderful things that we learned from this, just being able to tap into talent all around the globe and how we're able to bring those experiences, particularly during a time where, as you can imagine, education has been impacted so gravely by the pandemic and school systems, families around the world, and to be able to have that in the classroom really was an opportunity. Increasing access was an opportunity to rethink our courses, but also just our learning experiences. Because I'll leave with this last point in that, connection is incredibly important, whether that's face-to-face and online. You can certainly do it virtually. And I, again, commend my faculty and staff for ways of still finding connection. As one faculty member said, with Zoom, everyone now is in the front row of the class. You can still make those connections. People are vitally important. So we've really been trying to harness the uniqueness of this year, but also the advantages that having people around the world together in these learning experiences, what that's given us.
Thank you, Bridget. Can I just ask a brief follow-up question, which is, what did you learn from that new round of admissions? And going back to what Alan was saying, that the pandemic essentially forced, I think, many organizations around the world to engage in experiments that they wouldn't have done otherwise. If you can just speak briefly, and it's somewhat implicit in what you were saying, why this kind of experiment wasn't run before.
Sure. We have very much been based on a residential program. Our master's program is a one-year program with the expectation that people will move to Cambridge. What we realized inadvertently in this experiment is the great deal of talent that wants to connect with Harvard, who absolutely would benefit from engaging in our coursework with our courses, but who are not able to leave their jobs. They have complicated family situations where they were not able to move to Cambridge for a year. We identified a great deal of talent, more in that, say, 8+ years of experience, who had already been moving up in their institutions as leaders, and may have had family situations where it was untenable to move to Cambridge. But these are exactly the kind of pool of students that we love to serve, that we have great experience serving. And again, during this time of urgency, when leaders are so desperately needed in education, given what school systems, both K through 12 and higher ed, are going through. This is really a contribution we can make. And so we are looking to build upon that as we go forward, thinking both about residential as well as continuing this increased access and reach with a high quality online program.
Thanks, Bridget. It was a really remarkable set of data, I think, that you and your colleagues gathered through that round of admissions, which perhaps will inform the second part of our discussion. Let me turn to Amanda. Amanda, you were leading the efforts of the college and the undergraduate experience. It's a slightly different challenge with perhaps the most diverse faculty across the university, from the humanities to the social sciences to the sciences, and the youngest group of learners at the university. No playbook for dealing with this. If you can take us through your thinking, your expectations, and what have been the key learnings.
So we, like the ed school, we made two very early decisions, or the FAS leadership made them, and they turned out to be crucial. And the first was, again, we decided we would be all remote. And we made that decision for precisely the reason Bridget said, which is that we felt like if we're going to make this pivot, we need as much time as possible over the summer to start preparing people. It turned out to be really important in another way too, which is that the FAS has been very conservative in its estimations always, first about our ability to offer in-person education, and then our decisions about how many students to bring to campus. And in each case, we attracted a lot of criticism initially, and then as our peer institutions had to walk back their more ambitious plans, we felt that it was more important to give students whatever certainty we could give them, so that they would not be surprised by late-breaking changes in plan. And this turned out to be really crucial for faculty buy-in as well. We were able to say to faculty, we know this is going to be hard for all of you to learn to teach in a new way, but we're going to tell you now it is going to be remote. There's not going to be a question of, is it remote? Is it in person? Is it hybrid? We don't know. We changed our mind in August. That happened at a lot of our peers. And I think that was really important for faculty to feel like we were respecting how difficult this was for them. I mean, they were learning a new way of teaching while, with small children at home the whole time. I mean, it was very, very challenging for them. The other decision that we made early on was that all of our instructors, both faculty and teaching fellows, would be trained in remote instruction. And so our goal was to raise the floor, to ensure a minimum standard of quality, and then enable certain courses. The resources were there for people who wanted to do a thoroughgoing soup to nuts reboot of their class, but we were focused on getting everyone to a certain level. So we very much focused on satisficing, not maximizing. And that meant, so this ended up meaning that more than 1,000 instructors did week-long trainings with us over the summer. And what we offered them was, here are some very high impact interventions. If you do this, make this small set of changes, it will have a very big impact on your course. And specifically what we focused on was engagement. And so our trainings focused on encouraging our faculty to think about all of the implicit forms of engagement that happen in in-person learning, both faculty to student, but student to student as well. And to think about, what happens in the hallway outside your class, what happens in these interstitial spaces around your class, and how are you going to recreate that online in a really intentional way. And so we worked with them on assignment redesign and course redesign so that, it's not rocket science. It's more frequent, lower stakes assignments, more group work, more project-based learning, more flipping of classrooms. So basically, our pivot to remote instruction was a pivot to active learning. And it has been received in that way. I think you can see, it's tough to say how students experience the fall. Bharat, you and I talked about this because, their experience of the fall semester is bound up in their experience of isolation, their experience of the pandemic. They're not doing their extracurriculars. I mean, all of these changes. But when you isolate the experience of the classes, what we hear from faculty is that they experience their students as doing the best work they've ever seen, which is what we would expect from a widespread pivot to active learning. Students are mastering the material and producing better work. And from the students, when we hear a complaint, it's a complaint that they're being asked to do too much work. and that they're being asked to engage too frequently with their course, or that their professor is always contacting them. These are good problems. We see that as a success. And I think the task for us going forward is going to be to provide a framework for students to understand that, to say, this new style of learning, it's not what you're accustomed to. It's not sitting in a lecture and then cramming for 2 exams, but actually research shows you're going to be retaining this material much better. This is a much more effective style of learning.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amanda. One of the things I'd love to do after Srikanth offers his reflections is ask each of you, what is the one example that you've seen during these last 9 months with respect to innovations in the classroom that has just surprised you? So Srikanth, I just want to pick up on where Amanda left off. She was talking about almost this realization, right, within the college and FAS about the power of active learning when it comes to online. At Harvard Business School, active learning has been, in some sense, endemic to the HBS classroom for 100 years. You don't need Zoom for active learning in the physical classroom. You led the transition to remote teaching in March and then to the hybrid classroom in the summer. What were the learnings from transferring a highly interactive in-person learning approach to Zoom? Was this a letdown? Were there positive surprises along the way? Just love to hear from you.
Thank you, Bharat, and I'll share my screen just to say a little bit about the different things we learned. So, as you mentioned, Bharat, this was a big difference for us because we were very used to active learning, and we're also very used to having this fabulous experience in class with active learning. So, heavily engaged class, and so the immediate challenge was, how are we going to do this online? Because it was not just moving online, but it was, how do you do case method online and how do you do active learning online? So for us, that was the big worry, I would say, at the time we got started. And we didn't have a lot of people who were doing this. So fortunately, we had something called the Harvard Business Analytics program, where a few faculty members had taught case-based classes online. And so we quickly assembled this team to try and develop all the things that Dan and Bridget and Amanda have already spoken about, which is creating this technology infrastructure, training of the faculty. One thing that we needed to do, and this was an important innovation and an important learning for us, is that we knew, given the amount of interactions that occur, because we were going to go into breakout rooms and we have small grid buzz groups, as we like to call them, those discussions that had to happen, we needed to not only train the faculty, but very quickly in that period of time train what we called online learning facilitators. So these were staff members drawn from all parts of the school who were supporting faculty in each class that they taught. And this was such a we thought it was going to be, and it turned out to be an amazingly difficult exercise. How do you do this online? Because you don't have the students, and in Zoom, and Dan will probably talk to us about that later, but the tiles move around. They're not used to seeing people in particular places. How am I going to remember? We love connecting comments that have been made, 50 minutes earlier, and where people sit is important, and we weren't going to get that. So faculty said they needed to practice it. And fortunately, thanks to the amazing work from Bharat, your old previous organization, Harvard Business Online and HBX, we managed to get a lot of students so that we could run mock classes. And in fact, in that 10-day period, I think if we hadn't run the mock classes, it would have been even more difficult for faculty to do it. And then, of course, all the backup. Very much like everyone described, we went with what was popularly in our task force called the minimum viable classroom. So don't let the best be the enemy of the good. If we were 80% comfortable with where it was, we were going. We would perfect it and improve it later, but no point trying to make this perfect. It would take too much thing. We got faculty used to Slack channels. That was another thing that turned out to be a very important step that we took. And we also very quickly pivoted from building the infrastructure to making sure how do we recover from problems. We knew we were going to have them as we were going along. So right at the very early stages, one important decision that was made was how do you get to operational excellence? So when there's a problem, how do you quickly recover? Because we knew that that was going to be a big issue for us, with everyone. And the last thing I would say, as everyone else has said, is, the faculty at the school love teaching, love making sure that everyone learns. So it was quite, never forget that time period from March 9th to March 23rd, where everyone was, really working. As I said, they wanted to practice. We had many training, and the practice really incredible. But we also tried to set up a culture very early on. This was going to be very hard because, and Alan said, what got done in 6 months versus 10 years. I would probably say this would have been true for us had there been no COVID, because it's not what we like. This we're so fond of this active learning and an engaged class and dynamic class, and how do you get that done online? And yeah, there were clearly initial problems. I think we're getting better and better at it. But we said, the best way is be very clear that we're not going to achieve everything that they want. There's no point presenting it that way, because that's not what it's going to be. Let's be clear that we're going to make mistakes, but we're going to do our best to correct them. And we laid out these 4 principles that I think were really important very early on. We have to be patient. You can't expect this is going to happen very quickly. We have to be forgiving. Everyone's doing their best, and if it doesn't work out, that's going to please forgive us for whatever errors will happen. Be resourceful, so continually think about what different ways you might be able to increase the class, because we also in that training quickly told people this is not a lift and shift. You can't do what you're doing in the class online. You got to design the class for online. And therefore, particularly in the case method, it's even more complicated. Boards become very important in our classroom. So how do you do boarding solutions and then be adaptive? So that, I think, worked quite well, Bharat, through the course of the spring. But it was very clear that the faculty and students were still eager to replicate the classroom experience even more. And so Nitin, tremendous leadership on his part at that time, made the decision that we would try and experiment with the hybrid classroom that you were just describing. And I'll just put up a picture of what that hybrid classroom looks like now. And what we were trying to do is make sure that in an environment where people could be in class in a socially distanced way, and there was a lot of work that had to be done just from the operations angle of the classroom. So air filtration, making sure that knowing the issues with the virus, and that was one important thing, that everyone felt safe. So health and safety was a high priority in the classroom. But the second was, how do you make sure that individuals who are online would feel just as good or feel that they were not sort of left out relative to those that were in class, because that was an important principle, I think, in the design of this classroom. We rotated students through it. So you got into the class and then you went online and then you came back again. Many of our students were on campus, so we could rotate them. They couldn't come into class, but they could be here. And I think if you had seen the first version of what we did, it was not very good. And altogether, by the time we came to this design in a matter of about 2 months, thanks to largely the work of the fabulous IT team, fabulous staff, faculty, students. This was a design team with everyone participating through a series of experiments, 80 in number, 80. So we ran 80 different experiments to get this classroom to where it is. We ended up, getting the hybrid classroom, and it has been a very good innovation for us. The students really love it. It's a real treat for them to come in and have this experience in class. So at the moment, we run the hybrid classroom. We have the online Zoom classroom that we said, and then we created what are the live online classrooms as well, where as you see these particular the tiles, they are actually much bigger and they show up, about 96 of them in class. There's no one in class, just the faculty and the tiles. And that has also been an amazing experience. So just think of it as if instead of people sitting in the classroom, these large tiles rise up above the faculty member, quite close to where they are. You can walk up to a student and look them in the eye while you're doing it. The cameras are such that it appears to them that that's what you're doing. So there are many different modalities that we have used.
Thank you, Shrikant. I have to say, just listening to the four of you, it's remarkable. We often, describe Harvard as a decentralized federation, which has all kinds of implications, I think, associated with that language, often not necessarily positive, but just looking at the diversity of experiments happening here, from remote teaching to active learning to hybrid classrooms. There's no question in my mind that the last 9 months, this decentralization, I think, has been a big strength. The other thing is, coming back, let me just share one slide here. This is the kinds of innovations, I think, that all four of you were referring to, which has sort of been unleashed, I think, by the faculty. And this is self-reported at the end of the fall. On what kinds of changes, substantive changes, was the question, did faculty introduce in their teaching? And you literally see this across the board. I mean, if you literally just take that last row, the number of faculty who've said it's been remarkable that we've been able to have guest speakers and content experts from anywhere in the world in our classrooms. And that's just one of perhaps 15 or 20 things. If I can just briefly ask each of you to share one concrete example of something that blew you away, that happened in the classroom. And Dan, I'm going to start with you. And it doesn't need to be necessarily something that happened in your school around teaching and learning innovations.
Sure. I just very quickly, I want to share, most of us, when we think of teaching, sort of think of PowerPoint as kind of a tool to use it. But I was particularly impressed at the way in which some of our faculty got around the use of PowerPoint to do live instruction. So if you allow me, I'm going to sort of quickly share here 3 examples that I think are, and I'll do that very quickly. So I call this alternatives to PowerPoint. So here is one faculty member. She teaches at the Kennedy School. Her name is Renee Loth. So she was trying to prevent what often happens in Zoom, which is when you present a PowerPoint slide, basically all the attention turns to the slide and not to you as the speaker. So she did something super simple. She just literally showed, she was doing presentation about the ABCs of writing op-eds. And she just held this for a few minutes while she was talking. All I can tell you is that I cannot get out of my mind those 3 words by just listening to her for those 10 minutes still a few months later. And there's no high tech here. This is just as simple as it gets, but it was kind of the intentionality of it. This is one of your colleagues at the business school, Rem Conning, who literally a week after COVID, this is no fancy hybrid classroom or anything like that. He literally just had a flip chart. And the way that he used it was simply amazing. And what I told myself after that is, I know how careful people at the business school are in planning their board work. And you usually have 9 boards to do this. And if he is able to adjust from 9 boards to a flip chart in the way that he did, then I think we all can. And it was just remarkable to see the skill with which he did this literally a couple of weeks after COVID. And then somewhat one of my favorite examples, although today it failed for me in my trying to do this with the new Zoom feature, is Mitch Weiss, who again recognized that whenever you present the PowerPoint, the attention turns to the PowerPoint, and he literally used Zoom's virtual background, a tool completely designed for something completely different, where you just put the image of the Golden Gate Bridge behind you to present some of his key slides so that he could still be in front of his students. So these are like 3 small examples. They're not earth-shattering, but literally happening, within 2 weeks of us turning into remote teaching and people quickly turning to do this. So I'm going to stop sharing and stop doing what these people were trying to avoid us to do, which is to share the PowerPoint slides.
Those are pretty stunning examples, Dan, because, what's interesting is on the one hand, they're hacks like Mitch is.
They are.
And on the other hand, it's combining super low tech with online, right? I think it's
yes.
Yes. Any favorite example? Bridget?
Sure, yeah. I think everything we've been talking about, really, this is the greatest, most substantial teaching intervention I think that's happened, at any time, quite frankly. I think what I have been most surprised by, pleasantly, is just how much change and improvement is possible, even during a short amount of time. As a faculty member for over 2 decades, I know how hard it is. I know how hard teaching is. I know how hard it is to improve, how hard it is to get faculty to change what they do. But I think we were all aligned and motivated to make this pivot, to make the switch, and to do well by our students. So just 3 very quick examples. I think of one faculty member who's a bit more of a seasoned faculty member, I think, who was struggling in his courses in terms of students' evaluations. And I'm so happy to report, this process had him take a step back and rethink about his learning goals. Think about, what are you really trying to get students to take out of this course? And he made a number of changes with support from our teaching and learning lab. And I started getting emails from him midway through the semester all the way to the end about just how excited and pleased he was that this was actually the best experience he was having personally, but also it's showing up in the course evaluations for students' experience. And again, this is a faculty member who's been at Harvard for decades and was able to make the switch. I have another faculty member who has traditionally struggled in his course to deal with issues of race and ethnicity. And given everything else that was going on, we use this not only as an opportunity to pivot to being online, but also to really invest in how we talk about difference, given what was going on with racial injustice. These are the conversations our students were having. They were looking for support, for guidance, and also thinking about this in education. And it completely paid off. I first knew about it because I had students coming to me unsolicited saying how much they were enjoying this particular course. And many of them had known from previous course evaluations that this had been an issue in the course. And so being incredibly proud of how this faculty member pivoted to be remote, but also in changing the content and the way that content was being dealt with. Just tremendous, although exhausting, I can certainly say. And then I'll say the final thing that I have witnessed firsthand, and this is with having students embedded around the world, particularly when we're studying the challenges that have been created by the pandemic and education and how to serve education systems. When you have a discussion and someone says, yes, I just saw this in the classroom today, I'm in Texas. Yes, this is what's happening right now in Malaysia. The immediacy of this is not just some far memory or I heard or I read in a book, but we have these leaders around the world who are bringing what they're grappling with in the classroom. It's made it for such rich discussions and really grounded a lot of kind of the theory and the evidence that we are reading about, but with real world examples. So that's just incredible.
Great examples, Bridget. And, just that last point, it reminds me of a conversation that I was having with Mark Elliott, who's our Vice Provost for International Affairs back in the spring, around this notion of how can we take geographic dispersion, which was necessitated by the lockdown, and turn it into an asset rather than a liability. It's a wonderful example. Before I turn to Amanda, let me actually invite all the participants on this call to also use the chat to offer their favorite example of an innovation they have seen, either in their classrooms or in someone else's classrooms in the fall. And while you're doing that, Amanda, I would love to hear your favorite story.
Yeah, so as you said, the FAS, we have all the disciplines. And so there are not a million, but there are a lot of stories about the person who very creative, the acting class that's now a class of the monologue, or the physics class where the students are doing the labs in their kitchens. Our engineering classes are sort of at this point toothpicks and marshmallows, the way Alan Garber was talking about. So there is that kind of creativity of transforming the kind of teaching that we always do in person into a new format. And that's been impressive, not very surprising, but very impressive. I think what has surprised me is people who took this as an opportunity to really think outside boxes that we took for granted. And so there's two examples of that. One is Anne Harrington, who just has reorganized her lecture course on mental health to, instead of students being assigned to sections in the same section meeting week after week, which is a thing we do because we have classrooms of certain sizes and a section gets a room for 15 students and then those 15 students meet every week. Instead, she sets discussion topics every week and students go to the section that most interests them. And so we're able to have very, very flexibly sized discussions because of that. And so she's trying to figure out, this gets us into learnings for the future, but she is trying to think about how to preserve that when we return in person. And similarly, a very interesting teaching experiment of visual artists, dance faculty, historians got together for a kind of shared co-working space called the Garden that they then invited students into as a form of class. This would never have happened except remotely. So I think that kind of reimagination of, or realizing that the walls are down and we can do all kinds of things now.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Shrikant, I'm going to have to restrict you to one example since Dan's already mentioned two from the business school. Would love to hear your favorite one.
Well, I think my Dan's example reminds me, first, of course, just the simple ones, Bharat. Amazing how faculty got very innovative about using tools like breakout room and chat. First we had this long debate about whether you should turn off chat, whether it will be very distracting, whether you should use it or not. And then the amazing creativity, just like we're doing now, where you give a question, you can get everyone's sort of thought bubble. And the idea of thought bubbles became a very big point, that if you're chatting something in, one person is answering, but if someone else is chatting, I know exactly who else to go to. And thought bubbles aren't available to you when you're in the physical class, because when someone's speaking, everyone else is quiet. It's in my head, but it's not anywhere that the faculty member can see. And the amazing use that a faculty made of chat and breakout, very simple tool. And my second, very quickly, Bharat, if you allow me, was just the range. The fact that people focused on content. So it's Dan's examples of very simple ones, but then I can take you to other faculty who had switches and you can go from different things. Turns out that you don't need to get that fancy. You can do with very simple things. If you're thinking about the learner as the place where you're starting everything off from, you can do very simple things and be very successful. So those were. This
is wonderful. I'm going to put in chat a link to what we're calling the Teaching Innovation Gallery, which is a set of 90-second videos that we've been recording with faculty from across the university. And we have over 50 of these right now. And I'd encourage you to take a look at this, particularly those who are teaching in the spring. I mean, this starts, I think, amplifying on the set of ideas and innovations and examples we're just hearing, but it's really remarkable what faculty are doing at the individual level. And by the way, if anyone is brave enough to volunteer a 90-second recording of their own, there's a link on that gallery page. Please upload it and we'd be glad to feature it for the rest of our colleagues. I'd like to shift to the second part of our discussion. I mean, you've given us a lot of food for thought in terms of what happened. Would love to start looking ahead. And as we do that, thinking about, what is it about this experience that we ought to make sure we bottle up or we take and flex going forward, not just for the short and medium term, but the longer term. I think, Bridget, the example you spoke about of having a new admissions round, which attracted an entirely new set of learners than one could have ever imagined for an in-person classroom. I mean, that's the kind of experiment where we start to think about expanding the funnel for reach and access to different kinds of learners. But that's just one example. I'd love for us to think about the possibilities, the transformative possibilities, if you will, for Harvard going forward. And before I turn to the panelists, I'm going to request everyone to participate in a poll at this point, which we're going to put in chat. Poll everywhere. If you can click on that, pollf.com. And if you can go to that URL, there's a single question that we would want your thoughts on, everyone who's on this call. In light of your 2020 experiences, what is one longer term change in teaching and learning at Harvard that you would like to see happen? And this could either be at the individual level in your classrooms, or more importantly, at the programmatic or institutional level of the kinds that we were just hearing about. And if you can limit your answer to 1 to 3 sentences, just take a minute or two for this while we're here. It's one of those moments in a classroom where I'm tempted to show videos and play music, but as my good friend Dan Levy told me, silence is sometimes a good thing. And once you're done, you're welcome to use the upvoting button to indicate observations from others that you find particularly intriguing. This is a brainstorming exercise. The more creative, the more diverse, the more powerful the exercise. This is wonderful. We're just getting a huge range of responses here. As we're doing this, Amanda, Bridget, Dan, Shrikant, if you'd like to react to any of these, you're welcome to.
Yeah, one thing that's certainly coming out to me, which was part of the theme of my comments, was, being able to hold on to this newly global audience. Mm-hmm. Being able to broaden our reach, the boundaries, both of who we're able to welcome as students, but also who we're able to bring in as guests. Distance not mattering, and even physical classrooms not mattering. That was one thing that came up, being online. And with the ease of breakout rooms, we didn't have to worry about classroom configurations. We could just hit a button. That's been a wonderful thing this year.
Yeah, this notion of more visibility into each other's teaching practices, I find also very interesting. The option for students to attend office hours virtually, and I think there was a recent Crimson article talking about the fact that it wasn't just the students who appreciated virtual office hours, it was the faculty who appreciated virtual office hours in their pajamas at 9 p.m.
There was another great comment about what we've learned about our students, that when we're all on campus together, we kind of lose a bit of the backstory of their home environments. And it's been incredibly valuable to learn more about them, to figure out how to meet them where they are.
Yeah, as we look at these comments, and it's really it's a remarkably diverse range of comments. I'd also like to invite our our colleagues who are on this call to volunteer to share their own experiences. Before we do that, in a sense, there's really two parts to this question, right? Sort of one is about possibilities going forward. What are the kinds of opportunities that we see or have experienced or have felt that we ought to give greater thought to as we think about the teaching and learning experience post-pandemic? The second is, what personally in your roles are you trying to do to trigger some of these changes? And for many of you, you're playing, in fact, dual roles here. Shrikant, if I can start with you this time. You're a new dean as of 12 days ago. It's the timing of the pandemic and post-pandemic really coincides with, I think, your tenure as dean. Can you share with us some of your thinking of what you're seeing as opportunities longer term at the business school?
Sure, and I think Bridget already picked up on, I think, the big ones that we are, I think, all seeing, and I think the poll suggested the same, which is, substantial increases in our reach. So we should be now aiming, for, 10 times the number of learners that we've been able to get to up to this point in time. It shouldn't be that the only way you can get it is if you come to our campus, just as Bridget said. You have both the fact that you can bring in a lot of people. So I think the opportunity there in terms of reach is fantastic. The second that I will pick up on is I think it can transform in a very interesting way, and I'll tell you where I think for us at the business school it will be a particularly valuable aspect is around experiential learning, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So I'll just try and combine that. I really think that we might be able to, done thoughtfully, transform how we might think about the MBA going forward. Lots of innovations possible in the second year of our program, particularly as you look at the hybrid classroom. So for us, I think the hybrid classroom decision was one where we are thinking about the classroom of the future. So you can have people sitting in class and you can have people coming on the screen and online. And imagine, for instance, and as you know, one of the we always worry about knowing and thinking skills. That's, of course, a very important part of what we do in the classroom. But the two other skills that we've always wanted to do more of and have always, I guess, we've tried different forms, but I think this might provide us a real opportunity is what we call doing skills and being skills. So the doing skills are how do you take what you learn and actually work with it and practice it. And while you're practicing it, learn how you might get better at it and what you might do. So imagine a class today that we have in entrepreneurship, and then you study it and you go through all the classes, and then maybe a year later or a year and a half later or 2 years later, maybe you practice it somewhere, and then, of course, you don't have the opportunity to go back and learn. So if one's thinking about innovative thinking, if you're thinking about experiential learning, the idea that you might be able to build that doing skill simultaneously, I think is a very exciting possibility going forward. So what might we be able to do to encourage students to do that? And of course, if I worried about being skills, and I thought that it was real, and which we do believe is very important from a leadership point of view, to understand people very different from yourselves, to get empathy and understanding of different groups that you might be leading, the opportunity to actually do that and learn at the same time is another huge benefit that I can potentially see going forward in the fundamental quality almost of management education that we might be able to deliver. So I can imagine courses, and again, you can imagine this in different locations, very much like Bridget was describing in different geographies. How does that work? So I think this is a hugely exciting opportunity for us there. Of course, there are also very interesting opportunities in online executive education, and each of us has a different way in which we might be able to do that. in our particular case, for instance, we have many programs that are only 3 or 4 days long that are at the business school, and people will travel, for 3 or 4 days to come for those 3-day programs. And one that I'm currently teaching it in, I'll give you 2 examples of that, Bharat. One, where the first question I got is saying, I hope after the pandemic, you still allow us to do it. One of the data that we're already seeing, we've for a long time tried to get much more gender parity in our executive education programs. This on the online offerings has immediately raised it. In my class, there were a number of participants who raised this point that if it hadn't been offered in the way in which it is offering, they would not have access to this education simply because of their personal circumstances. So what a fabulous way for us to be able to transform who gets access to our education. And then the last point I'll make is, I think there are courses that we would offer physically that ought not to be done physically, ought to be done online, because it's much better to give them that education in smaller chunks as they're doing and learning, rather than to give it all at the same time, of course, in entrepreneurship, but in many other areas. So, I think it's going to be hugely exciting in terms of very many different things that we can do, at least when it comes to management education. But let me stop there.
It's really interesting, this last point, Srikanth, that you made. When we think about executive education and the flexibility of sort of almost the programmatic offering that you can do in a virtual setting, it does make you wonder, sort of, why is it that we have 3 classes a day for 5 days in a row when it comes to in-person? And the only reason is the fixed cost of travel, right? Which ends up being the constraint that, in fact, impacts teaching and learning. By the way, I have to say, the set of observations in this poll is just remarkable. And there's some ones that we might expect at the top around trying to get more expertise beyond our faculty to speak with students, the synchronous, asynchronous mix, out of school experiences. But if you go down, there's one that's catching my eye. I think we should design all our courses and execute them as if the online constraint is real, because the online constraint increased our empathy towards students. Very, very interesting. Amanda, can I turn to you to ask about sort of, I'm sure your and Rakesh's and Claudine's mind is starting to move towards medium to longer term possibilities. What are the kinds of things that are being discussed?
It's a challenge for us. You pointed out that one of the distinctivenesses of the college is that the students are younger. And I would add to that, the residential is constitutive of the college experience in a way that I think is far more significant than in any other school. So I think it's a challenge for us because it's very important to what we offer that there be this in-person living and learning together. That said, I feel like what we have seen this year, there are 2 things I very much hold on to. And one is the recognition. I hope that we maintain a recognition that online is a legitimate mode of instruction like others. So I hope that we move into a model of there's a seminar, there's a lecture, there's a lab course, a studio course, an online course, and that the online modality is most appropriate for certain kinds of courses. And I would also hope that we can preserve online teaching as an option within a course. So you can imagine, the day you bring in the guest speaker, maybe it's better for everyone to be in their dorm room and on Zoom than to awkwardly have her on a screen when everyone is around the table. The day that the writing class is breaking into peer review groups, probably better to do breakout rooms on Zoom than it is to try to crowd 5 small groups in a small classroom. So holding on to the affordances of remote instruction is one. 2 would be, I think I'm so glad to hear others talking about increasing our access because I think that our ability to imagine that prior to this was really constrained by a default assumption that the remote was always kind of lesser. And I think we held on to that assumption, even though we had the example of colleagues who did outstanding quality online courses. We still sort of presumed it wasn't as good as the real Harvard experience. And I think holding on to the recognition that we can offer high quality online courses, I think that there's opportunities. We could not have done what we did without the Division of Continuing Ed. And so to continue working with them to think about how to combine more FAS offerings with DCE to our learners around the world would be fantastic. I think there's opportunities for our students, our college students, to study abroad. Right now, they're very reluctant to go abroad because they don't want to miss out on the Harvard instruction in their disciplines, which I sympathize with, right? I mean, I also think it's high quality here. But if it could be possible for them to do their concentration work online while living abroad and taking some other courses, I think that would give us a lot of flexibility to send our students out into the world, as well as bringing the world to us. And then I think too about we had been sort of stalled in thinking about a pre-matriculation program for students who come from high schools that leave them underprepared. And we couldn't quite get our head around it because we thought, well, online would necessarily be low quality. But now, no, we see it can be very high quality. And so I think that has opened up for us all kinds of pre-matriculation work in targeted skills to get students up to speed through a kind of assessment, giving them pre-tests, figuring out where they have gaps, filling those gaps before they arrive to campus could be great. So what I'm doing about all of this, we are doing so I think we all recognize that the gold standard is the well-done hybrid classroom, of the kind that HBS does. And so now we are piloting some hybrid experiments this spring with an eye to preparing for the possibility in the fall that we may not be in a public health situation that enables us all still to be together in the normal way. But I also hope if it works, if these sort of hybrid pilots are successful for the FAS, possibly we could hold on to that as a possibility, even when things return to normal.
Great, thanks, Amanda. I think that covers a lot of ground. And in fact, we had a question from the alumni stream from Ann Bain asking of you, Amanda, has any thought been given to expanding Harvard undergraduate enrollment remotely as the GSE has done? And I think you've really touched on these issues to the extent we're thinking about this in terms of hybrid or multi-platform experiences and programs, right? As opposed to an either or as being corner solutions. Before Bridget and Dan speak, let me just make an announcement that if you're welcome to put your questions in chat in about 3 minutes. We're going to turn to Q&A with everyone. So you're welcome to post your questions in chat that we'll forward to our panelists. Bridget?
Thank you. I definitely want to build on what my other panelists have said. I think, recognizing the legitimacy of remote education, online education, and in fact, it may actually be more appropriate for certain kinds of learning experiences. And I think building also from Shrikant, the Harvard Graduate School of Education as thinking about education professionals. And we have been already thinking a bit about lifelong learning that is necessary. As we think going forward, we do continue to think about a residential program master's program that tends to be, for people who have a few years of experience, whereas an online mode might be most appropriate for someone who is mid-career. It allows us to expand our reach, but also it allows us to think of different kinds of learning experiences where remote education, actually mixing of both residential and online students and the experience levels and being embedded in classrooms, for our profession, how valuable that is. But then also thinking about the lifelong learning piece of it, where it would be helpful, to space out the learning opportunities or to apply them while you are in your profession, that being critical. But beyond just courses, one thing we've really discovered is the importance of networks in our field. Again, the urgency of what education is confronting right now, and the fact that so many education leaders feel siloed in so many respects. And we have lots of experiments going on. And so part of what our role as an education school has been to help host networks where principals, where superintendents, where leaders are able to connect with each other and with our faculty as they're grappling with these challenges that are quite urgent. So the fact that remote education, virtual learning, these tools allow us not only to think about courses, but to think about connection, to think about continual learning as the world continues to evolve and what is essential. I most hope that we, looking forward, continue with this mindset, this growth mindset with the experimentation. I'm certainly doubling down and investing. And I see one of my colleagues, Josh Bookin from the Teaching and Learning Lab, has been just essential to get us into a position where we're willing to try things that otherwise would be scary, and are seeing tremendous benefits in what it's doing for our students and what it's doing for our faculty, that we continue to push on that innovation and that experimentation in a responsible, supported way, because we are discovering ways that we're serving our current students better, but also ways we are tapping into other students and the field in general to have the impact that we're looking for as part of our mission.
Thanks, Bridget. That's really, really helpful. But one question I'd also love to pose to all of you is the implications for collaborations across the different schools going forward. Since one of the things we saw during the during the remote teaching period was, and a few colleagues like Michael Sandel and Dan Schrag had offered what we were calling university courses, which were open to every student across the university, which in normal times would be really, really difficult, right? To trudge across from Longwood to the Yard is not the easiest thing. And when we think about those kinds of opportunities, I just welcome your thoughts after we hear from Dan.
Bharat, I did prepare some thoughts, and I did prepare some very nice slides, but every inch of my body right now is saying that I should cede my turn and let everyone ask questions right now. I think that would be time better spent.
The mark of a good online instructor.
Thank you.
And I should say we're also experiencing time zone differences since Dan is 6 hours ahead of us right now. So it's midnight, I believe, where you are. Thank you, Dan.
Yes, thank you.
Let me open up. There's a question here around class size. Can the class size increase if we have both online and offline students? And this is from the alumni stream, so I don't know if anyone would like to respond.
So Bharat, I can take a quick response. I take a quick response to that. So I believe the answer to that is yes, in different ways, and we'll have to think about how best to do it. I think building on your point about either university-wide opportunity, so that's another opportunity to increase class size without our current students being in any way not able to take the class. So that's, I think, one example where we can certainly experiment there. And then building on Bridget's point around lifelong learning, I think we would very much welcome the experiment where alumni, as the field has moved, so take machine learning and data science and AI that has happened, alumni who have learned much earlier may want to take those classes, and it'll be fabulous if they can just do it by coming online. So that's again increasing the class size, but increasing it in an important way, Bharat, by which their contributions to the class would be extremely valuable, because they're like 10 years out. They know certain things that our students would benefit from learning. So I think both not only just the increase in the class size, but an improvement in the quality, both in the cross-university as well as alumni. Now, can it go much, much bigger? Some of my colleagues believe you can go even much, much larger and, double it, triple it. And those, I think, also would be interesting experiments. And we're sure to try some of those as well.
Thank you, Shrikant. There's a whole bunch of questions, so I want to make sure we get to them. By the way, just on that point, I will refer to now what has become known as the Mike Smith 5% rule, which is we don't have to teach and train the whole world, but reaching 5% is not a bad objective. The one question from Karen Knoop around the distinction between online teaching and learning, which is online also allows students to be more distracted and easily distractible. Has the quality of student outputs remained stable despite the change in teaching modality? And I'm going to do something that I have not done in a while, which is cold call a colleague, in this case, Eric Mazur, who said a +1 to Karen, but also because Eric 3 days ago texted me saying online teaching is better than in person, 3 exclamation marks. And so, and I think he was referring to learning. So Eric, wherever you are, we'd love to hear from you.
I'm right here. Well, I didn't prepare anything, so you are catching me totally unaware here. Yes, I have done a combination of, throughout my career, I've always done pre-post testing to see how much actual learning there is. We found, and this is a project that we do together with Angela Duckworth, the author of Grit, who was a former student of mine long time ago. And we found one metric, just to give you one metric, a huge increase in self-efficacy in the course. So normally in an introductory physics course, for those of you who don't know, I teach introductory physics to non-majors. These are not people who are taking the course because they want to learn physics. They unfortunately have to learn physics because either they're going to be an engineer or a pre-med. So when I taught a lecture-based course, the self-efficacy went down, even though my evaluations were very high. Then I started to teaching interactively using peer instruction, and I was crushed when I saw that the self-efficacy remained flat. This year, it has increased more than the standard deviation. So it goes up. In other words, the students coming out of the course have a stronger belief in their ability to succeed. I'm sorry, self-efficacy is perhaps somewhat of a jargon. It is basically, it measures a person's belief in being able to succeed if they try. On top of that, we've looked at content learning goals, and they have also gone up from when it was a lecture-based course. So all of those measures are significantly better than they were ever before. On top of that, the evaluation of the course, I'm still glowing. I was celebrating this weekend after seeing it. I've had high evaluations for when I taught required courses, but it's much harder, elective courses, but it's much harder to get a high evaluation when you teach a required course. Anyway, happy to share data and say more about what I'm doing, but yes, I do firmly believe that there are huge advantages to teaching the way we are. And I know that when I go back to the classroom, there are definitely things that are going to keep from what I'm doing now. In fact, probably most of it.
That's wonderful, Eric. And by the way, for those on the call, Eric is moderating, in fact, a session tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. on rethinking assessment, which really captures, I think, some of the great innovations around assessment that have taken place in the university. Want to come back, Teddy Swornos, one of our colleagues from the Kennedy School, is curious about examples of courses with pedagogical approaches that truly could only take place online as opposed to in a hybrid classroom. Teddy, can I invite you to say a little bit more?
Sure. So I'm very impressed by everything, certainly that HBS has been able to do, but also many hybrid classrooms in general. But one of the interesting things that struck me when I've been working with faculty and folks has been the fact that being online means that we are free from certain constraints that exist in both hybrid and in-person classrooms. Certainly there are other new constraints that we have to worry about, and certainly teaching in a pandemic is not ideal. But I'm curious to know if folks have examples of courses where they really could not imagine teaching the way they did in person, because so much of it was asynchronous, or so much of it took advantage of the networking capabilities of doing things online, something along those lines. I would just love to hear innovations that are unique to the online context.
Really interesting question. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to speak to that, or anyone else.
Again, Bharat, I can give you one example, Teddy, if you like, and that is particularly around topics of either of the two that I mentioned, Teddy, where it's innovation or entrepreneurship, where you want to learn certain things at certain times. So, an entrepreneur wants to know, how do I get my first sale? And they get that. And then you later on want to learn about how do you scale? And then you get that. In innovation, you want to learn much more deeply about customer preferences, and then you get that. And then you want to ideate, and then you get that. And then you want to prototype, and then you get that. So anything where there is a doing component to it and getting the learning at the time of doing, it's, I think, not a very good model to force it into 3 days. We used to do that only because of the convenience of travel. Yeah,
it's a great question, I have to say, Teddy. And as always. It's hard to come up with an answer to one of your questions, but food for thought here. One of our alumni loved Shrikant's suggestion about opening up courses to alumni, perhaps an evolution of the university course. So thumbs up for that. I want to come back and Bridget, maybe get your thoughts on, we've spent most of the session talking about changes at Harvard. If you can speak to what's happening beyond and some of the implications of this, not just for higher education, but K-12. I mean, just sitting where you said, what are the kinds of conversations happening?
Sure. I mean, opening this up, I think is quite important. It's a dramatic time for education. I think, two major themes in the conversations, at least with higher ed, very much mirror our own, but I think they've been happening, with fewer resources, and that is the role of the faculty. As I noted before, I've been pleasantly surprised at how much change and growth and improvement is possible, but that takes serious investment. And Amanda alluded to before, with some of our peers, I think it's been incredibly difficult to have constant disruption versus making a serious investment and committing, for a particular path. You've certainly seen differences, not only higher ed, but also K through 12 world. And then the second piece, again, is knowing our students better and trying to figure out how we can meet them where they are. And the university having far more resources and time to think about that and the full wraparound services that we give our students versus other institutions. I think that's also been incredibly challenging for K through 12, where there haven't been simple answers to the question of, should they bring students back in open schools? Should they have hybrid? Should they have remote? I was thinking even earlier, Teddy, about your question. The hybrid works, but you need certain conditions, both in terms of your physical spaces and technology and the training and the students' ability. And what we see in higher ed and in K through 12 is just incredible variation in the physical plant and the buildings and the neighborhoods and the families and what resources they have and teachers. So at the K through 12 level, this has been even more complicated because each context is different. Each public health situation has been different. And so I think that's made it incredibly challenging for lots of school leaders, where there's been huge differences of opinion in communities about what is the best way forward. What I think we do have to do looking forward is capitalize on the innovation that is happening. The fact that there are great stories, the fact that teachers are working incredibly hard and still emphasizing connection, still meeting with their students. And so how do we make sure this year is not a lost year in terms of learning? How do we supplement beyond the school day, beyond weekdays, and even going into summer, additional learning experiences for students, because it's entirely possible to be able to do even more to make sure our students are not falling behind. But it will take a moment of trying to capitalize on lessons and those places where they have been able to make forward progress. I think Harvard has been a tremendous example, and it's wonderful to share on this panel with colleagues across the university so many innovations that are going on. I think, Bharat, this has been a great example of One Harvard. We're seeing incredible coordination in very, very real ways across the university. Now we just have to figure out how to do that for this education system writ large.
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. And, I think as you were alluding to, in fact, I'm also looking at the comments in the poll everywhere. What's striking is this notion of thinking expansively, I think, is almost cuts across three different dimensions. One is the collaboration across schools, which I think are arising, as you said, quite naturally. The second is extending into our alumni base. I think all of you at some point have talked about how we haven't really cracked this notion of lifelong learning, which we've been speaking about for a while, but I think the opportunity to now think seriously about it and take advantage of what we've experienced opens up new doors. The third, and I just saw one comment, which is cross-university courses, not just cross-school courses, which I think is sort of fascinating. I mean, we have an example with David Malin teaching Yale students, but there's no reason why it can't go the other way. With all this in mind, though, let me come back to the near term now. And Amanda, one of the things that all of you have pointed to is the importance of also what's happening outside the classroom. And it's interesting. I was talking to one of the undergraduates recently, and he said, and I said, how was your fall experience? And he said, actually, with respect to teaching and learning in my 4 courses or 5 courses, it was great. I probably learned between 90 and 100% of what I would have otherwise, but it was everything else that we missed. And I just want to come back to that. We're going to be remote in the spring. It's one of the biggest challenges, obviously, right? What, if anything, is possible during this coming semester to speak to, I think, those kinds of experiences, sitting where you sit?
You mean to reproduce the kind of sociability? Yeah, it's a problem. I think that I think that the college, and I'm sure this is happening across the schools, is working very hard to provide opportunities for students to interact in the same kind of sort of casual way that they used to. I think one thing we've learned from students is that they like courses where they get randomly put into different breakout rooms every time because they just want to meet other students. They're able to maintain ties with their close circle of friends, but this kind of casual interaction with somebody new, they want to have reproduced. So we can do that in the classroom, and the college is trying to do that socially, but that's where Zoom fatigue kicks in, I think. That once they've done all of their schoolwork on a screen, they don't then want to go socialize on a screen. And I think it's a real challenge. I kind of feel like when they write to me and say, what will you do to enable us to socialize? I keep saying, you don't want what a 50-year-old lady thinks you should do for social. I hope you innovate. I hope this is a time for the young people to figure out new ways to interact online.
Yeah, no, and I think, it also goes back, I think, Amanda, to the decision that you all had made in the summer to, as you said earlier, unbundle remote teaching from in-person living, which, of course, given the capacity constraints, we could only get certain numbers of students back to campus. Hopefully that increases. But yeah, thank you for that. We're almost at time. I just want to take a moment just to say a couple of things. One, thank you everyone on this call for your comments in the poll. We're going to be starting a series of conversations and some formal work as well over the next several months to start to think about this question of what are the longer term implications and, in Bridget's words, the transformative possibilities for teaching and learning at Harvard at this moment. And in some sense, I think that list of comments almost provides a wonderful seed to those sets of conversations. The second is a remarkably stimulating discussion by our 4 panelists. And let me just close by thanking you not only for your contributions on this panel, but also, frankly, for all the work each of you has done over the last 9 months towards helping our colleagues, our students in so many different ways, for which I know many, many people are grateful. There's 4 or 5 sessions to come over the next few days, a very stimulating set of ideas to build on. And it'll be really interesting to see what 2030 looks like. But if I were to summarize, I think the key message of this conversation, in many ways, I think the answer lies in our hands. So there's a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you all. Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you for spending this time with us today.
Thank you, Bharat. Great being with you.
Thank you, Bharat. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We hope you'll join us for more events in this week's showcase, beginning tomorrow at 10 a.m. with online community building, successes, and challenges. We also recommend the dozens of videos newly recorded by Harvard instructors in our Teaching Innovations Gallery. For details, go to vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events. Good night, everyone. Look forward to seeing you soon.